neoliberalism, hyper-globalised capitalism, financialised capitalism over the last 50, 30 years, a growing disparity in wealth, particularly around not just income, which is often the focus of anti-poverty activists, but also wealth and assets. And certainly I think we have to understand that this is the background against which to understand populism.
I suppose I'll start by picking up from something John said. How does someone who's a billionaire TV star become seen as anti-elite and as the friend of the working class, and similar analogy made by Trump? And I think it's a challenge for us in the progressive movement, because we think class too much about income, and of course it's a very important factor. But then we get somebody like Trump, completely uneducated, and we paint ourselves as the champions of the working classes, the champions of the downtrodden in the progressive movement. And as soon as somebody educated reaches the top, we annihilate them. Look at the man, he's a moron, he's an idiot. We've got these, I'm making assumptions maybe about the audience, but generally the movement is on the left, progressive, is well educated. And as much as we want to stand up for those who haven't had the privilege of education that we've had, regardless of our income background, as soon as somebody uneducated hits our media, hits our mainstream, and you can even look at, say, Jamie Bryson more locally. We don't tackle Jamie Bryson in the issues, we just criticise his spelling on Twitter. And we wonder why is Trump more appealing than we are? So I think that's a challenge to us, and it is all about. I'll let people more academic than me argue about the merits and demerits of populism, and John's point about, can populism be a good thing if it's on the left, if it's for good? I think for me it's about how we tell our story, or the fact that we don't. I think probably one of the most dangerous phrases that we maybe use is, "Oh, sure, that's only anecdotal." That's only somebody's lived experience, is what we're really saying. What you're telling me doesn't matter, because we have an evidence base that says you're wrong. So it may be your experience, you may feel it, but actually, look at these people who are much smarter than you. Look at the evidence they've gathered. They've shown that you're wrong, and you should listen to them. And it's why we had this kickback against the experts. I don't think it's we should move away from evidence base, or we should, somehow, I suppose, pander to that anecdotal experience, whereby the evidence does contradict it. But the kickback against the experts is the experts aren't listening to our lived experience, and I suppose again comes back to John's point about immigration. If people keep telling us over and over again that their experience in immigration is a problem, it's not enough to say, yes, but the evidence shows immigration is good, because that person doesn't feel like it's good for them. Now, as I say, I don't believe we need to change our policies or our values to move to that. I just think we need to tell our story differently, or we need to tell our story, because sometimes we're telling the evidence, we're telling the facts and figures, and we're not telling the story. And ultimately, that's where populism has been successful in creating, and let's face it, and if we want to talk about fake news, and creating a narrative, almost literally inventing it. We have a truthful narrative, but we need to start telling it as a story. And again, as a movement, we tend to have the creative people in it. The storytellers tend to be more left, more progressive in their politics. So why do we struggle so much? I think we bash people over the head so much with statistics and evidence. We forget to tell them a story that connects with the human. And I mean, something I always end up talking about green politics, that ultimately it's about people, whether it's climate change or energy efficiency in homes. It's about the people who live on the planet or the people who live in the homes. It's not these things for their own sake. So I think we need to get back to people. We need to get back to telling a story that people can connect with. And we need, I do think, the big challenge for us, and I say this in my own party, I'm conscious of being recorded and whatever else, could get myself in trouble, but I think sometimes, we're fighting the rights of the LGBT community, women's rights, black and minority ethnic rights, and for everybody else, but the big struggle, and we talk about an inclusive society, but I think the big place where we sometimes struggle is including people who aren't as educated as we are. I think we find that as a challenge. How do we include these people in what we're doing? It's not enough to look to the future and say we'll change the system so by the people get a better education and that there's less educational underachievement. How do we include people who have underachieved, who've been the victims of the policies of the right, and bring them with us and tell them stories, and in fact entrust them, those who we do find who share our vision but who maybe aren't as articulate, how do we let them tell their story, why they're green in the case of my party, or progressive or left, and put them up front, because we always say, well, when it comes to women, we need to see women politicians so that women can identify. We need to see black and minority ethnic politicians so that those communities can identify. Well, we maybe need to see some people in politics on our side of the debate who maybe aren't as well educated, who aren't as articulate, who don't have a degree. And I think that's a challenge for us. And then when we start telling the story and we start putting forward people that the working classes can identify with, who they do connect to. I mean, we're certainly not as bad in Northern Ireland politics-wise in terms of I think the distance. We when we had an executive, we didn't have a millionaire executive, so at least we don't have that degree of distance. But I think as a movement on the left, as progressives, as I say, I think our big prejudice is around education. We will fight for people's income. We will fight to improve education, but are we including people who aren't educated? And we're here at Queen's University discussing this, and I suppose in that sense it couldn't make my point better. We need to have these conversations in community centres as well, and that's where we need to talk about Brexit, because talking about it here, it's kind of, I always talk about the socialists and their mass movement. We're going to have a mass movement. Okay, can I join? Well, no, you're not really socialist. Well, can this person join? Well, they're not really socialist either. And the mass movement's broken down to 5 people and their dog who really committed them. So I think that's the challenge. And I suppose one other point I'd make specific to Brexit. Again, we talk a lot about I suppose the policies, the rights and wrongs and the consequences of Brexit. I think with Brexit there's something fundamental about democracy. It wasn't that it was wrong to have a referendum. To me, it was wrong to wait 40 years to ask people what they thought. Europe became something that happened to people. There would have been the people back in the 70s who didn't back the initial referendum, or who didn't, or who maybe changed their minds, became, had regretted the initial vote. I think there was an issue about our democracy there, that it was, well, you voted for it now, and now you have to live with it for the next 40 years and on. I think we need to have, democracy has to be about much more than that. And it allowed the media the space to criticise Europe over and over and over again, because the people hadn't re-endorsed it. And certainly as somebody who was born after the initial referendum in 75, many of our citizens never got a say, and those who did as I say, we're sort of told to leave it. So I think if we look at what's happened, referenda, as we know, is a very imperfect means of gauging public opinion. But if you combine that, as they have done in the South, with a citizens' assembly or the constitutional convention type model that they've used, whereby you're using proper deliberative democracy to then inform a decision it's ultimately made through referendum, I think we can enhance our democracy. And I think that's the biggest lesson, one of the biggest lessons anyway for me from Brexit, is that you can't ask people to vote once. And I would apply it to the Good Friday Agreement as well. And incidentally, we're almost 20 years on from it. You can't gauge public opinion once and say you have to, that's it, you've voted now, and we will forever use this. And I've heard it done in the Assembly with Good Friday Agreement. 72% of people voted for it. Yes, in 1998. If you really believe in, and you want the people you're speaking to believe in what they voted for, then don't be afraid to ask them again and again and again to re-endorse it, and to bring. And it means you, as a politician or a supporter, have to keep people with you. You can't just bring them with you once, win one debate, win one battle, and assume you've won the war. So I suppose that's for me, and that's why I suppose I want a referendum in the final Brexit deal, because I think Brexit's a disaster and we need the option to change course, but also because I believe in a democracy. You don't just get one chance. You continually get to have your say. It should be a constant conversation with citizens, and we need to keep asking questions, and we need to keep asking the public their opinion. And as I say, we as a progressive movement, as a green movement in my case, need to find the language, need to find the stories, and need to find the ways to include those who the populists on the right are winning over.